So according to some vague social media rumblings, Doug Ducey, the former governor of Arizona, is potentially eyeing a run at Arizona's Senate seat, setting up for a contest in the primary between the MAGA darling Kari Lake. And obviously social media rumblings is not the best way to get information, but I thought we'd entertain this scenario since it is theoretically possible that Doug Ducey does enter the race, and sort of puts an interesting spin on the Senate contest, since now we have multiple candidates, some of which are in the more MAGA lane, and others who are more in just the standard conservative wing of the Republican Party. So we're going to talk about what Doug Ducey could mean in the Senate race, and why I think Doug Ducey would be a much better choice for the Republicans in Arizona than somebody like Kari Lake. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I certainly think the Arizona GOP has made a number of fatal mistakes over the past decade or so, which has really seen them drastically reduce their influence in the state politically. I mean, they have a Democratic governor now, you have a Democratic Secretary of State, you have Arizona now as a purple state on the federal level as opposed to a Republican state as it has been historically. So a lot of things have changed in Arizona over the past decade, and some of that could be chalked up to the changing demographics of the state, which I think I sometimes underestimate in some regards, but I think most of it has to do with the quality of candidates the Republican Party in the state actually puts forward, and also the amount of money the state party actually has, because as we might talk about in a future video, the Arizona GOP does not have a lot of money at all, because a lot of their money has been siphoned into either Donald Trump's legal bills or Kari Lake's doomed to fail appeals for her overturning the election case or whatnot. So, of course, that element certainly hurts the Arizona GOP. Coupled with demographics, you certainly have a recipe for disaster. But somebody like Doug Ducey could return a sense of normalcy for the Republican Party in Arizona and actually make it viable on the federal level once again. Because while Arizona is theoretically a toss-up, I think at this point in time, it's a state that leans Democratic when it comes to most contests. I mean, going into 2024, I think Joe Biden certainly has the edge in the state over Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is the exact type of Republican that ever since 2016, Arizona has rejected time and time again. And I think even despite the fact that Joe Biden is very unpopular and, you know, the economy is sort of not on the up and up as the administration would like to think, I still think Democrats have a more than 50% chance of winning Arizona in November at this point in time still, despite the fact that Biden's 16 points underwater. And that's because of the fact that, again, Arizona has a weak operation for Republicans. Democrats have obviously mastered mail-in voting in a way Republicans just can't. And I think part of that is because Donald Trump has discouraged mail-in voting since really it became popular after COVID. And the Republican Party has never recovered their mail-in numbers since. I mean, you did see a slight resurgence in Virginia with Glenn Youngkin and the successful mail-in operation there. And, you know, it was successful even though the Republicans did lose, because they took a state where almost all of the toss-up, I think all of the toss-up House of Delegates and state Senate seats were all Biden won, and Republicans won essentially all of the seats that Biden had won by less than 10 points. So that's still a 10-point swing towards the right in these districts, despite the fact that Republicans still lost, and perhaps we can cover that in a later video. So I don't necessarily think that the Youngkin strategy on mail-in voting failed. I think it very much was a success. But, you know, going back to Arizona, Doug Ducey is somebody that can bring the Republican Party of the state back in proper footing, I think. Now, if we go back to the past couple of cycles or so, obviously Republicans have had pretty disappointing showings in Arizona. You had Blake Masters, who was almost tied in the polling with Mark Kelly on Election Day, ends up losing by almost 5 points. You have, of course, Kari Lake, who was 5 points ahead of Katie Hobbs, who really ran a pretty poor campaign, in my opinion. She wasn't really doing many events. She wasn't talking to a lot of media. She was avoiding interviews. She seemed like a candidate who was afraid of Kari Lake, because Kari Lake did have a very imposing personality. She was certainly cut out for the media sphere. And yet, despite all of those things, Katie Hobbs still ended up beating Kari Lake, albeit very narrowly. And of course, even if we go to 2020, Arizona went to the Democrats for the first time since 1996 in a presidential race. So Arizona has changed a lot over the past couple cycles. We can go back to even 2018 with Kyrsten Sinema's win. Democrats have just been doing a lot better. It's because they're winning over the suburbs. They're winning over the voters that Republicans used to win over. Now, I know suburbs are not the same as they were 15, 20 years ago, and we can make a separate video on that if we talk more about demographic change in the U.S., but a lot of these suburbs can still be won by certain types of Republicans that don't just completely repel these more moderate and center-right voters that for decades had voted for the GOP and now are sort of voting for Joe Biden and just standard Democrats. Now, Ruben Gallego is not a standard Democrat. He's a very progressive Democrat. But put him up against somebody like Kari Lake, and he's probably going to win just because of the fact that these suburban voters can't stomach somebody like Kari Lake. They'll vote for Ruben Gallego, even though he's a much more progressive Democrat than they are, because they just don't like what Kari Lake has to offer. And, Doug Ducey is somebody who I think Republicans can actually get behind and pitch to these types of voters as a more moderate conservative candidate that can actually win, because Doug Ducey is winning margins in Maricopa County that are unthinkable in today's political landscape. Winning with 56% of the vote in Maricopa County, a 14-point win, as compared to, say, 6-point loss for Republicans just 4 years later, is pretty remarkable. And on this same exact ballot, as Doug Ducey won a second term for governor, Kyrsten Sinema beat Martha McSally by 2.4%, and she won in Maricopa County by a considerable amount, by around a lean margin. So, Doug Ducey has a considerable amount of crossover appeal. I think many Republicans in Arizona just don't have. Kari Lake doesn't have it. Mark Fincham certainly didn't have it. And Blake Masters didn't have it either. But somebody like Doug Ducey, who, again, I always say that you can't necessarily go back in time and look at past election results to predict future outcomes, but it still is worth mentioning that Doug Ducey has a pretty good track record electorally in the state. He won both of his elections by likely safe margins, so he really wasn't in that much of a competitive position. And going into 2024 against somebody like Gallego, I think he would poll fairly well. Taking a look at Kari Lake's polling, in the vast majority of polls, Ruben Gallego is up ahead, despite the fact that Arizona is not a state that typically elects progressive Democrats, because I think when you have a contest between Kari Lake, who's sort of this MAGA sycophant who is not trying to win over independents, who's completely pandering in a partisan way to a general electorate, versus somebody like Ruben Gallego, who is at least trying to pitch himself to independents and moderates despite not being one, they're going to pick Ruben Gallego. Because compared to Kari Lake, who pushed all these election conspiracies and has tied herself to the hip to Donald Trump, Ruben Gallego seems like the sensible, moderate, quote-unquote option. While I certainly don't agree with that, that's just how it's going to come across to Arizona voters in the places where it matters. Maricopa County, Pima County, these population centers where it really is the suburban center-right voters in the outskirts of the cities that make all the difference, because Arizona is a heavily suburban state. I mean, looking at the rest of these counties, over 70% of Arizona's population lives in Maricopa, Pima County. So the great majority of Arizonans live in these areas. And these are the places where Republicans have been losing ground time and time again. And somebody like Kari Lake is just going to continue the culture of Republicans losing very winnable states, whereas somebody like Doug Ducey could restore that. Now, there is an argument from a Republican perspective that, Doug Ducey's not the type of policy conservative that we want. He's not right-wing enough. He's not MAGA enough. But it's really not about Doug Ducey's policies. It's about his optics and the way he appears to voters. He's a sensible person. He's able to work across the aisle on issues where Republicans actually do get victories, like school choice and things like that. So you could still be a very conservative Republican and have good optics. When you're parading around with, January 6 organizers and Stop the Steal people and whatnot, those optics are toxic to suburbanites. They're kryptonite. And somebody like Doug Ducey doesn't have that problem because he very much was standing up against that crowd. And, while that hurt him a little bit with Republican base voters, that gives him a lot of credibility with mainstream Arizona voters. And that's honestly an ad that Doug Ducey should run, talking about how he stood up to Donald Trump when it came to the 2020 election. Because, again, that might hurt him a bit with Republican diehard voters, the MAGA voters, but overall he's going to win over a lot more people with an ad like that than the trade-off will be among those voters, which I suspect is going to be very minuscule. But, Ducey is somebody that could raise a lot of money. He has connections within the political sphere in Arizona. He'll be able to campaign effectively. Kari Lake can raise money. I will admit that. She will raise money from all over the country. And in some cases, she'll have backing from most of the Arizona GOP, which now is basically the Trump-Kelly Ward GOP at this point. Although there is some discontent in the ranks of the Arizona GOP, she's still not going to have the crossover support needed to win. So at the end of the day, regardless of whether Sinema's in the race or not, Kari Lake will not beat Ruben Gallego in the Senate race. Somebody like Doug Ducey has the chance to, and again, I still think it might be a bit of an uphill battle because Biden's likely to win the state overall against Donald Trump. But Doug Ducey, if anyone's going to have the crossover appeal needed to actually win in Arizona in 2024, it's going to be Ducey. So again, this is just a social media rumor by someone in the MAGA world. But if this does turn out to be true and Doug Ducey does decide to put his hat in the ring, he could potentially win that primary as well. You have Sheriff Mark Lamb, who's very much in the MAGA wing of the GOP, and Kari Lake very much in the MAGA wing. If you have somebody like Doug Ducey, who's sort of outside of that sphere altogether, Kari Lake and Mark Lamb, provided they both stay in the race, are going to split that vote, and you'll probably see potentially Doug Ducey win, especially since you'll probably have organizations like Americans for Prosperity and these groups that, from the Koch brothers that back more conventional Republicans coming in and helping him with the ground operation there. I certainly think he could win a primary, but again, all speculation, social media rumors. I just thought I'd put my 2 cents in there, of course. I think Doug Ducey is the strongest candidate at this point in time Republicans can put forward, because he's the only Republican, quite frankly, that has any experience winning statewide in Arizona, even after it's become much more of a purple state like Ducey in 2018. So he's really the only person that actually knows how to appeal to those independent, moderate, center-right sort of McCain voters in a way that Kari Lake and certainly Mark Lamb could never do. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.